Okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm David McLain from the College of Business and Entrepreneurship. It's great to be here this morning and wanted to talk to you briefly about how I integrate the artificial intelligence tools that are available to us, that would be Gemini 3 Pro and NotebookLM, into supporting the research process from conceptualization through publication. And with that, let me share a few slides, which are, of course, generated by Notebook. And I'll talk over it. So, the idea underlying this is to think about artificial intelligence tools, specifically Gemini 3 and NotebookLM, as research assistants, something that is rare on our campus and yet can be very helpful tools for advancing a research program. Now, when I think of research assistants that are AI oriented, not only are they available 24/7, they're indefatigable, but they can only serve in certain roles. Artificial intelligence, no matter the claims, really doesn't serve as the human that's necessary to organize, supervise, coordinate, and really check for mistakes that can be generated by artificial intelligence tools. This is simply at its core because we're a knowledge factory. We're generating new information, new knowledge. And as a scholar, we have to generate new theoretical insights and new research findings. AI can't collect data from a survey from real human beings, can't measure the blood flow in real human beings. It can't do the things that in the real world are essential to essentially making research happen. So at present, artificial intelligence serves as research assistant. And I suspect that as time passes, more academicians will realize that their role is in the generation of new knowledge. It's what's not known, what AI cannot do. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is where we can apply these research assistants in the work that we do. So, let me make this next slide appear. I've got about a 20-step process. This is my approach to research. It's different for every scholar, but my first set or phase of research steps involve the gathering of information, reflection on existing information, identifying where there are holes, flaws, problems in existing information that's available in the world, and then trying to find my place in making a contribution to correcting that absence. Second phase involves structuring and grounding a particular research investigation to make that contribution. The third phase is to actually create a report that explains that contribution to knowledge as well as its shortcomings. And then finally, it's getting that report through the process of making it presentable or publishable, which is quite a daunting process. And if you take into account this entire process, it's a multi-year process, and it is full of bottlenecks, problems, setbacks. It is not a linear process. It is an iterative, a recursive process, and a frustrating, slow process. But using AI as research assistants can greatly speed and enhance the execution of this process and its successful completion. So, as I've mentioned to you before, these research assistants, everything from literature search to analyzing, constructing the methods of analysis, creating the code, whether it's SPSS or R, to analyze the data, constructing tables, constructing graphs. All of this can be enhanced by using AI-related tools. But different tools are good for different steps in this whole process. Unfortunately, Notebook and Gemini are linked together such that if I want to ask a question in Gemini, I can draw on my Notebook documentation that I've provided to help answer and to channel and to reduce, well, I know what they call it, hallucinations. I call it lying, the lying that artificial intelligence is so good at doing in order to try to make people happy. And I'm giving it an excuse for lying, but it's really not a justification. We have to, as humans, as knowledgeable in our expertise, double check that information that comes from AI and make sure that it's correct and not a lie. So let's go forward. This is what AI considers its advantages. I might apply AI in slightly different ways, but Notebook, generally speaking, helps reduce errors or lying in the knowledge that's generated by sticking almost exclusively to the information that you provided in the set of documents that are available. And I don't know what the current limitation is on Notebook, but I've submitted as many as 30 documents to Notebook to draw on, to generate synthesis and to scrutinize, and found it to not be overwhelmed by that. I am told that you can reach a limit as high as maybe 300 documents. I certainly haven't gone that far. But the key here is that Notebook can very quickly identify what themes are in the documents that I've submitted, can identify what gaps exist, what needs for research exist, also identify underlying theoretical issues that are important to the stream of research that's in those documents. And I find it does it so quickly in moments that it is very versatile and very helpful. And in addition, can cross disciplines to help me understand better necessary alternative discipline insights that can help support my particular research stream in which I would not have deep knowledge in. Gemini, on the other hand, a lot of generation, a lot of creation, a lot of brainstorming, new ideas, and also is very good at being a very harsh critic and serving as an informal reviewer. And I pre-review documents before I would submit it to a journal. This I find to be very important and will increasingly be important as the competition for publication increasingly difficult in the future. So what do I use AI for? Well, and the AI flywheel is now 4 segments that I can support with different tools, Gemini and Notebook hours available to help advance. And I don't want to understate how important the bulletproofing of our reports that are submitted for conferences or publication is in the process. But it's also so good at the tedious formatting tasks, whether it's fitting a style guide specific to a journal or creating in tabular format the material that's necessary for tables in a document. It does a lot of great things so quickly. But again, as a human investigator, you've got to supervise this in order to make sure that it works accurately, correctly, and generates the knowledge that you are providing as integrated into the report that you want to disseminate. And so Notebook can do some amazing things, including mapping relationships across research articles to help identify the relationships between authors' ideas. And this can help you identify the seminal stream for a particular theoretical pathway that you're following, and maybe help you understand why your theoretical perspective needs to be refined if it's to be understood by other scholars in the field and also follow the path toward a meaningful contribution. when we look at specific articles and do two things that Notebook can do very effectively. It can look for problems in the existing research stream, but can also search through in the discussion sections of articles the consistent themes identified in the needs for future research that are a part of every research article that I read. And overall, then help you identify where your research will be most acceptable and most useful. So what does it do? Gemini can take a lot of information from the web on which it's trained and help pin down very specific information such as statistical analysis and specific details and problems that exist in the literature. Whereas Notebook can take a subset of all of that and therefore avoid the lying by just sticking to the content that you provided in the specific documents. Once we get to drafting a report, which can often be a tedious, long process, Gemini and Notebook in concert can do wonders for speeding that process. And for example, checking the completeness of your reference list, the DOIs, checking consistency and logic across the document, checking the text for flaws and errors, just does a great job of double checking my work, standing over my shoulder, serving as a research assistant to help me speed and improve the process. The last process is if you want to brainstorm some titles, great. I change titles a lot on articles that I write. I can use Gemini to think about alternative titles, most of which are bad, but sometimes can trigger an idea of how I might alter a title and present it better. I can also have it look at my abstract. I would never have it draft an abstract because, again, I've found that at its current state, Gemini and even Notebook just don't seem to do an adequate job of drafting abstract, but can certainly check an abstract and point out anything that might be improved or might be an error in an existing abstract. I use, and this I think is one of the most valuable uses of artificial intelligence, I use Gemini and Notebook as informal reviewers, getting the time and support from a reviewer, a human reviewer in my field. I have a lot of generous colleagues, but it's difficult. They have busy schedules. It can be tough. I remember talking to a colleague, David, down in at North Carolina, and he said, "Oh, I would love to help, but I've got 39 programs I have to do a review of in the next week." It's just busy people. By using artificial intelligence, I can not only conduct informal, harsh, critical, red team reviews and serve as devil's advocates in review of my document, but can also ask it to estimate the likelihood of the success of my document once it is submitted and being actually accepted. And I use a criteria of getting that percentage up to over 90% before I consider it acceptable for submission. So it's a recursive process and therefore a complex process. I use artificial intelligence to help speed the frustrating, the tedious, the difficult process, and help me spend more of my time on thinking of how to contribute to knowledge and to generate new ideas. That is all I have to say. We are at 10:45. That gives me 5 minutes to respond to any questions and ask you if you have any comments.
I did just look up, and we are limited to 50 sources in NotebookLM. So you were still well under it, but it's the Plus plan that has 300, I think, or something like that. And
Well, okay, so
not great.
50, I haven't hit it yet.
So yeah, it's,
That's
yeah.
good. I
And
could.
people have kind of round it by combining PDFs into larger PDFs too.
Yeah, they're yeah, the context window, the token limitations, I think about those a lot, and sometimes I run up against problems, but uh, and more a problem in terms of the memory and it wanting to hold on to old things that are wrong and abandon new information that I need to incorporate. That's a problem I have with AI generally.
David, I'm always interested in what's your strategy, what tools you use, and what's your strategy for using either NotebookLM or Gemini or another tool for literature reviews.
For what?
A literature review.
Literature review. This is a tricky one. Every literature review has a different kind of prompt. I know that a lot of people use their prompts to help generate skills and then store skills in, say, Claude Cowork or other tools. But I found that I really have to write a different prompt each time. And the literature review will fall into maybe a couple of categories. One is, what's the theory that is demanded by the authors in this stream that I'm going to get hit with is if I stray from, and I might ask, what's that theoretical foundation that really is dominating the stream? And then I'll use a literature search to jump into other fields. For example, a lot of my current work depends on the field of behavioral neuroscience. And so it's not a field that's familiar to me. I go into the literature search by asking, in the field of neuroscience, can you identify the list of papers that are seminal? Two, can you identify the most recent advances relevant to the specific phenomena I'm trying to study, which is always going to be occupational safety or decision making? And then three is from that literature, can you provide me a concise formatted reference list so that I can go look for that information? So those are the two things. I try to see what's the field expect, and number two, what's the knowledge underlying that, and then try to then take that information. I'll probably feed it to some extent into NotebookLM or some tool, maybe just my brain, and look and say, okay, so what can I take from this and use? Where do I go next?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If you're online, you can either type them to the chat or unmute your mic. Any questions from anyone here?
How many people do we have with us? Do we have 6 participants today?
There's 6 online and 5 here.
Okay.
And it's recorded too, so there'll be more in the future.
Okay, great. Great. When will the recording be made
It'll
available?
be posted, I hope, by the end of the day, if I can keep up with everything as we go. And so, and it'll be listed right on the agenda.
So, I'm sure there are a lot of other prompts that I might use in literature search or in other aspects of supporting research, but let me mention one aspect of research in my last comments. That's the generation of measures. You can use artificial intelligence tools to help look for measures that can be kind of obscure and hard to locate for specific constructs that are relevant to a particular study or testing of hypothesized relationships. But also, in most studies, one of the important elements of contribution is to create a new measure or survey to generate that information necessary for answering or testing our hypotheses. And I found that Gemini serving in the chatbot role can help me generate items, but that if you rely on Gemini to generate items, they're pretty awful and have not been able to generate anything really that useful, but it has generated ideas. And that, as scholars, and we can be happy that, we have a role to play here. We have to apply our expertise and knowledge to critiquing what is generated by AI because we know better. And that I don't think is going to change soon.
Any other questions? Excellent. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all.
I'll stop the recording.